The US National Intelligence Council report says Egypt has lost its leading role among Arab states and that power in the Middle East is passing to Saudi Arabia, which is reluctant to assume that role. Has the criteria for deciding who leads and who follows in the region been reduced to the amount of support for US interests? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mariam Namazi. Egypt has lost its status in the Arab world. A recent report by the US National Intelligence Council, or NIC, into American interests in the Middle East has been made public. It's a damning assessment of the country that was once considered to be a paragon of democracy in the region. The report goes as far as suggesting that regional leadership may pass to Saudi Arabia. The war in Gaza revealed what many believe were weaknesses in Egypt's influence in the Middle East. The NIC report identifies why Egypt's role may not be as strong as it once was. It states that President Hosni Mubarak is getting older and may no longer have the energy to provide the leadership he once had. It goes on to say Egypt doesn't enjoy the comparative advantage it once did. Other states in the region have massive oil revenues and other economies have improved faster than Egypt's. The report concludes Egypt no longer has either an attractive political or economic model to offer the rest of the Arab world. So what does it take to be a leader in a region notorious for diplomatic pitfalls? Well, traditionally, influential figures in the region have been seen to lead pan-Arab interests. These include standing against any perceived Western domination and fighting for the independence and development of the nation. On the Arab street, it's often been considered that strong leadership in the region would also lend its support to Palestinians in their pursuit of a state. Some observers have suggested that Egypt has fallen out of favor with the Arab world by bowing to American influence and choosing to become a mediator since the signing of agreements with Israel. Well, joining us today are our guests in Cairo, Ezzeddin Shukri Fisher, an international politics professor at the American University in Cairo and a former advisor to the Egyptian foreign minister. In Washington, Aaron David Miller, former advisor to 6 secretaries of state on the Middle East and author of The Much Too Promised Land, America's Elusive Search for Arab-Israeli Peace. And in Jeddah, Jamal Khashoggi, editor of the Saudi daily newspaper Al Watan. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Fisher, if I can come to you first, has Egypt lost status in the region?
I think we shouldn't read too much into those 5 pages and half that were published recently. Those are obviously conclusions of a workshop rather than a coherent and substantiated report. Now, on the issue of leadership, I think the conclusions here mix up 2 things. There is an important difference between the leadership capacity and the level of engagement in regional conflicts and issues at any given time. The latter is decided depending on the context, depending on the chances of achieving results. Now, because the report looks only at some of the regional players' behavior and doesn't look or question or look critically at the US Bush administration behavior in the region, we have a twisted image of what was going on in the region and a lack of understanding of why a country like Egypt chose to engage less in main conflicts in the region throughout the last 8 years.
Mr. Miller, let me put this point to you. Was Egypt ever really the leader in the Arab world that this report seems to suggest?
Well, there's no question that as the largest, most culturally dominant and most powerful military state in the Arab world, that Egypt was a huge political and cultural center of gravity for many years. The issue of leadership is relative. I mean, Egypt is weak in comparison to what? The Arab center is weak. The Jordanians are weak. The Saudis are weak. So the notion that Egypt has lost its influence, it seems to me, is simply a fundamental misunderstanding of who is strong in this region and who is weak. You essentially have regimes that are coping as best they can in an effort to deliver deliverables to their constituents, who have serious and fundamental problems with legitimacy, who are challenged by Islamist movements, but who have managed in a very resilient way to maintain their national interests and to survive. So the notion of ranking or rating Arab states, not to mention the notion that somehow the mantle of leadership has somehow been shifted to Saudi Arabia. I mean, if Mubarak is getting old, what does that make King Abdullah? So I think
well, let me put that point to Mr. Khashoggi. The report does say that leadership in the Middle East is now passing to Saudi Arabia. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I don't think Saudi Arabia will buy much into such a report which give it such accreditation because even though it is true that Saudi Arabia is becoming more influential, but it would much prefer not to fly solo in the Middle East and work jointly with the Egyptians. If we go back and check every single important policy, Saudi Arabia did not carry it out alone. The first country to check it out with was Egypt. And this policy been going on for Saudi Arabia through decades, ever since King Abdul Aziz's time, the founder of Saudi Arabia. He believed in that joint mission between both countries. Okay, there were up and downs between Saudi Arabia during Nasser time, etc., which weakened all of the Arab world. And obviously, both countries learned from the mistakes of the past, and they don't want to repeat them.
But interestingly, the report also notes that Saudi Arabia's foreign policy, Mr. Khashoggi, I'll put this point to you as well. It says that Saudi Arabia's foreign policy has been ineffective, that they have failed to reconcile Hamas and Fatah. They brokered the Mecca agreement, of course, which fell apart. And they also failed to bring the various Lebanese factions together. Can Saudi Arabia really do much better than Egypt?
It's even if it is ineffective, that it did not bring results or a final result, but it is the only with the Egyptian foreign policies which are active in when it comes to the Middle East issues, when it comes to Lebanese issue. The Doha Accord would not have taken place without Saudi Arabian approval and involvement. When we had a serious crisis in Gaza, it was the Egyptians and the Saudis who went to New York and who lobbied for a ceasefire. So it doesn't always bring the positive result we need, but those countries, Saudi Arabia is the effective, it is the country which is active in the area in the Middle East when it comes to creating initiatives, leading foreign policies. And thanks God, we always have the Egyptians by our side, and obviously the Saudi want to keep it that way, not to create a split or a competition or who leads first. That is not really. This is very beside the point issue. It is the most important point is to have Egypt strong and to work with the Egyptians all the way.
Mr. Fischer, does this report necessarily tell us anything that's new, anything that we didn't already know? Because President Hosni Mubarak has been getting old, as it says, for some years now. Political freedoms have taken a massive blow under his rule. The country is a mess economically. Hasn't Egypt's influence been diminishing for many years now?
As I said, I think the report is confused. I think, as the other guests have mentioned, number one, in the Arab world, there has never been, at any given time, one country that was the leader while the others were being led. If you look in the 60s, 70s, and all the way through, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Iraq played important roles. The question is, do they work together or do they work separately or against each other? This is what determines, to a large extent, their degree of success in delivering results. That's one. The second element is, there is no contest in leadership, and the issues themselves are difficult. Look at the internal Palestinian conflict, for example, or the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinian-Israeli conflict. On both issues, the interactions are difficult. Saudi Arabia tried its hand, Egypt tried, Yemen tried, and none of the three managed to achieve the results they wanted. But this it is not unique to Egypt or to the region. If
so
you
let
look
me
at
put some of what you say to David Aaron Miller. What does this report tell us about America's approach to the Middle East, or at least the way the US views the region?
Well, look, the reality is on the four core issues that define American interests in the region right now: extricating American forces from Iraq and leaving a situation there better than the one we found, trying to figure out a way to either contain the Iranians or create a modus vivendi with them, doing something about the very difficult problems in Lebanon, and 4, dealing with the Arab-Israeli issue. The fact is that neither Arab mediation or influence or American policies have been terribly effective in dealing with any of these 4 core issues. And we haven't even talked about the problems in Afghanistan. I mean, the fact is that the Arab states, in a region which wrongly has been viewed as highly unstable and extremely conflict-oriented, the Arab states have managed, quite deftly actually, to maintain continuity and stability for a long period of time. So if you want to judge influence, you start with, are these regimes stable? Can they protect their territorial integrity? Can they deliver political and economic benefits to their constituents? It seems to me those are the real tests of influence, not the degree to which the Qataris or the Saudis are going to be able to broker a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas.
Qatar is one country that's attempting to play a greater role in resolving disputes in the region and in the wider Muslim world. They successfully broke an agreement with the Lebanese government and the opposition last year. Recently, there were negotiations on Darfur and a conference on Gaza. Mr. Miller, how does the U.S. view these efforts?
I think the reality is that the Arab states have stepped in to fill a vacuum, a large vacuum, which has been created over the last 8 years by the absence of American leadership. But it also reflects something else. These are neighborhood problems. And while the United States may play a role in helping to create these problems at times, and also, I might add, to help resolve them, the neighborhood is going to have to be addressed by the neighbors. It's very hard for a great power to act in a way that's truly effective.
Well, let me pick up on that point that you say, because this report coincides with Egyptian efforts to forge a lasting truce between Israel and Hamas to consolidate those very shaky ceasefires, which each side declared separately to end Israel's 22-day offensive in Gaza. Mr. Fischer, is it fair to say, really, as this report suggests, that Egypt has lost clout in the region because it is currently the only country to be talking to both Israel and Hamas?
Well, it is the only country who's doing this at this time. But I would like to remind the viewers that it was the United States who opposed the Saudi intervention when the Saudis were trying to bring Hamas and Fatah together in Mecca before. And it was the American administration, the Bush administration, that ultimately wrecked that agreement. So it is, as Miller said, it is unfair to look at these issues and think and try and use them as tests for the leadership in the region. Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others have been trying to achieve things not only in the absence of American engagement, but against negative engagement by the Bush administration. Now, the test is not to examine how solid and stable and legitimate those regimes are. I think this is the wrong question. I think the right question is to see where do we want to go, even from an American point of view. How can we help our friends and allies who are willing to work with us in order to achieve this? And this applies to Afghanistan.
Mr. Miller, what's your response to that?
I think it's a fair point that the dysfunction that affects this region, and let's face it, this is a conflict-ridden, dysfunctional region. It's missed out on globalization to a large extent. There's an enormous democracy deficit here. There are more democracies in Africa right now, a continent which has been traditionally viewed as an international basket case, than there is in the entire Arab and Muslim world. And the reality is that America, and believe me, I'm not here to defend the consistency or perfection of American policy. America is not going to be able to fix the dysfunction, the internal dysfunction that continues to ail and affect the region. We often make those problems
I just want to
worse.
return to this issue about the ongoing negotiations that Egypt has been brokering between Israel and Hamas. Mr. Khashoggi, I wanted to ask you about Israel's position in all of this, because in the middle of negotiations, Israel said, no shali, no deal, referring, of course, to the Israeli soldier that was captured in 2006. How much of an embarrassment was that for Egypt?
Okay, and Egypt had difficult time in the latest crisis, and after, due to certain limitations, it has. I was in Egypt myself last week and driving to the airport, and I saw the big job any Egyptian administration will have running a country as big, as complicated as Egypt. It doesn't need the problems of Hamas, of Gaza, of Darfur, but they have to play that role. The Israelis will never, I would never expect them to help there. But I would agree with the report about Saudi Arabia not interested in playing its role, and that is also applied to Egypt. I would like to see the Saudi playing a more proactive role rather than to just be a broker between Hamas and Fatah. We must apply pressure. We must apply this old principle of the big Arab brother to the
Mr.
to the
Miller,
smaller
Israeli
brother.
envoy Amos Gilad was quoted as saying the government had an inconsistent approach to the truce talks that was, quote, insulting to the Egyptians. Does all this perhaps call into question political will on the part of Israel to reach an agreement?
Well, there's no question that you have a severe political dysfunction in Israel. You have no leader now who has the moral authority or the historic legitimacy to make the kinds of decisions that are required, either in negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, or frankly, between Israelis and Syrians. And you have an even worse dysfunction that exists on the Palestinian side, where you have a national movement that is in profound crisis and has failed to produce one authority, one gun, one negotiating position. So, and I would be quite sympathetic here to Arab state efforts, because I do not believe that any outside party, whether it's key Arab states or the United States, is going to be able to create, as if in a laboratory, an Israeli and Palestinian leader capable of taking the kinds of decisions that are required to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Part of the problem is we have a
what you say then to Mr. Fischer. Is there a limit to Cairo's willingness to involve itself in Gaza because Egypt doesn't want to perhaps be fully responsible for the territory?
Egypt doesn't want to be responsible for Gaza because Gaza is under occupation, and Egypt wants to make sure that Israel is taking care of assuming its responsibilities towards Gaza. But I want to go back to your issue, to the issue you raised about the current negotiations between Fatah and Hamas as an example for the problems we're facing here. Egypt is doing this work almost alone, and this is mission impossible. Where are the other actors? If this to work, you need other Arab countries to weigh in, because the issues have also regional dimensions, as we can see. But also you need the American administration to come in and help, both on the issue of reconciliation, but also on the issue of the ceasefire and on the Gilad Shalit
Well, Mr.
exchange.
Miller, do you agree that Israel's position...
If you give me a second to finish this. To get a deal, you need more than mediation. Mediation is not only to talk to two people and get their views and try to find a common ground. It also, you need a capital to pressure the parties and give them incentives so that they accept a deal. And Egypt alone will not be able to do this with Israel and the Palestinian factions all at the same time, while the others are sitting aside and waiting.
Mr. Miller, as Mr. Fischer points out, Israel's position on such negotiations inevitably leads to the question of America's influence. Will the US ultimately have to pressure Israel to stop all military activity in Gaza and the West Bank, to open up Gaza's border crossings, to end the siege? Will America have to get involved, get its hands dirty for there to be an agreement?
There's no indication right now, even though we literally own, two of the agreements that affect the situation in Gaza. We helped negotiate a border crossing agreement in 2005. We helped negotiate an Israeli MOU on anti-smuggling, and yet it seems we're not really involved in trying to implement in a serious way either of these two agreements. Given the fact that we do not talk to Hamas, and I see no chance, zero chance, that this administration is going to change that policy, we have no choice, and I welcome the Egyptian effort, Your guest in Cairo is absolutely right. The Egyptians do need to be supported in this effort. I think the broader problem, though, is much more fundamental. We face in this entire region, including in Israel, a fundamental leadership deficit. The Sadats, the Begins, the King Husseins, the Arafats, the Assads, the King Hassans, they're gone. And in their place, we have politicians, not statesmen, who are prisoners of their politics, not masters of their constituencies. And without real leadership on the Arab side, on the Israeli side, and clearly on the American side, none of the problems that we've identified are going to be resolved.
Mr. Khashoggi, we heard Mr. Miller saying that that the U.S. position on Hamas is unlikely to change. Does some sort of long-term solution involve the U.S., but also countries in the region, countries like Saudi Arabia, giving Hamas some sort of recognition of its political power?
Egypt and Saudi Arabia represent the leaders in the Arab world, represent the big brother who should talk to the younger brothers and get them to carry out.
So what about the 2002
agreements.
Saudi Peace Initiative, the Land for Peace Initiative? Saudi Arabia has said that that proposal will not be on the table forever. Could there perhaps...
Yeah, but if we want, that is the only proposal, the working peace, the possible working peace agreement between the Arab and the Israelis, and it should not die away. The only way to carry out such hope for a future peace agreements is for the Americans to play their role by pressuring the Israelis, we the Saudis, the Egyptians, playing our role by bringing Hamas to accept the Saudi peace initiative. That is the only solution we have on hand. Just to be a mediator between Palestinians factions will not bring peace among themselves to begin with.
So, Mr. Fischer, with that in mind, can Egypt still bring about a durable ceasefire between Israel and Hamas? Mr. Fischer, if you can answer that question.
And the Saudis can't do that.
Neither Egypt nor Saudi Arabia nor anyone can do this alone. The name of the game is multilateralism. Each one has assets, and those assets need to be put together for a durable solution to emerge. Apply this to the ceasefire. Egypt has a limited amount of pressure that it can exercise on Israel. We've seen with the Olmert and Gilad Shalit issue. You need the U.S. to weigh in on Israel for these issues.
Well, Mr. Miller, let me have one final point from you. Mr. Fischer has consistently made the point that multilateralism is the name of the game. But this report suggests that the U.S. is still looking at the region in perhaps a black and white way, dividing the region into allies and enemies. So I guess my question is, how much does the U.S. stand to lose by constantly siding with autocratic, isolated governments? At the end of the day, does it serve U.S. interests?
Look, there are two realities that have to be acknowledged. We have interests in this region, and we have friends. Those friends are not perfect. The Israelis are not perfect. The Saudis are not perfect. The Egyptians, Jordanians. Three of those Arab countries have serious problems with respect to abuse of human rights, the absence of accountability and transparency in the way they deal with their respective justice systems. Israel has its policies in the occupied territories as well as its discriminatory practices with respect to Israeli Arabs. But the alternative to relying on the Israelis and the moderate Arab center is essentially chaos. So the reality is America will continue to stand by the Israelis as well as our key Arab allies. We have no alternative, and we need to seek a kind of evolutionary change in this region that resolves the Arab-Israeli conflict and at least points key Arab states in a better direction with respect to their own governance practices. We cannot impose democracy on them. We shouldn't even be thinking of this.
On that note, thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us from Jeddah, Jamal Khashoggi, editor of Al Watan newspaper in Cairo, Izzeddin Shukri Fisher, director of the Arab-Israeli Peace Project at the International Crisis Group, and Aaron Miller in Washington, D.C., former advisor to 6 secretaries of state on Arab-Israeli negotiations. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.